This
Start recording.
conference will now be recorded.
Okay.
Hello, welcome to Let's Talk Business. This is JoAnn Forrester, and I'm with my good friend, co-host, and very smart technical man, Sal Acosta. I don't know what I'd do without him. And I'm delighted that we have again a favorite person of mine whom I've gotten to know, Marie K. Eder, Mary K. Eder, I'm sorry, a retired Major General in the Army. She's a renowned speaker, author, and fellow lover of history. And through her book, she has brought to prominence women's stories that have not been told. One of the books that I first read was The Girls Who Stepped Out of Line, which talked about the amazing World War II heroics of women that fought Nazis, that just made amazing difference. And then a book that I was also very fascinated with is the Girls Who Fought Crime. It's a special story about Detective May Foley, and she has been a role model for many women. And I know how difficult it is for women to break into the police force, because we had some of the issues here in my city. But she was, I think, the first woman. And so, Mary, I'm really delighted that you're on here. Oh, before I forget, she was featured in the Women's Voices Hear Them Speak 2026 calendar and was our keynote speaker at the 10th Spirit of the 19th Amendment. Made a great speech. People were rushing up to get her autograph in the calendar that she's featured. And that was a great time. So welcome to our show, and thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you both for having me, and it's great to be back home in Pittsburgh.
Yes, tell people you're originally from
Mercer County. I grew up in Stoneboro and went to school at Edinburgh, now part of Penn West. Sal and I were talking about that before you arrived. And so it's always good to come back and see friends and family.
It certainly is. You and I met actually through an internet connection, and I read your book. I was just fascinated about it. The book, the Girls Who Stepped Out of Line. Just give me a brief outline, and then we're going to move on to other times of that book.
Sure. That book is about a number of women, 15 of them, in fact, pulling them back from the margins of history to tell their story a little bit. It's not that they were ignored per se following the war, but there's so many stories to tell. And for years, it was the major stories, the politicians, the generals, the big battles, the Medal of Honor. And so some stories were just not as prominent. And then time moves on. So to be able to find some stories that are not well known, and I found some of them quite by accident initially, and then began to find more. And so I wanted to tell these stories because it's not just about what they did independently, but where they were, that they knew about each other. And, we talk about, well, if I see somebody who looks like me and makes it, then I have a goal or I know I can do it. They didn't have any of that. They had each other and they made it work. And so I was fascinated by them and wanted to tell their stories. But the next book came about because one of my friends read the first book and said, well, I like that, but you really need to write about my husband's grandmother. She was a cop in New York City starting in 1918. And I said, what? What? Tell me more. So she gave me a few newspaper clippings and I was hooked. And that's where the second book came from.
And let me just interject a quick comment for everyone that's watching. We did do a previous interview on the girls that stepped out of line, and JoAnn in her introduction mentioned the calendar and a lot of other things. We're going to put links to everything in the description. So if anybody wants to buy the older books, the newer books, the calendar, we'll put links to everything in the description to help people.
Mary, you said you were hooked on May Foley. What did you find out about her that was so exciting?
Well, there were not really women police officers during the First World War, at least not until about 1919. They were matrons in New York, as they were in other major police departments across the country and in London. And they were the ones who looked out for runaway children or women who were victims. They cleaned the jail cells. But there were a few who actually went undercover in around 1911, 1912, and they were rewarded with becoming detectives, receiving a detective rank. But by 1919, the department decided we needed to hire women, and so they hired a first group of 10, then a second group of 10. But May was one of the volunteers during World War I, and there were about 5,000 of them. May's group patrolled the streets of Broadway, making sure it was safe for theater goers to come out at night. And this is about the time electric lights were coming into being on the big streets. And they called it the Great White Way. So New York was transforming into a modern city at the time she started. So I like her story, and it is set against the major events of the 20th century because she lived through all of them. By 1923, she decided she wanted to join. She had 2 children. She and her husband talked about this, and it was a deal. You want to be a detective, you can join Pinkerton's, or you can try another job first, but I want to join the department. Because she got to know the people while she was there as a volunteer. She liked them. She wanted to continue to be part of that. And so she joined in 1923. Her badge number, her shield number, was 31. The numbers now are in the 30,000s.
Oh, wow.
That gives you an idea.
Yeah.
Now, Marie, do you know if back then the training itself was integrated, or was the training separate? Um, and also, once you were actually on the street again, did you have a well, first of all, back then, did you even have a partner? And then, was it a male partner? How did you were you able to research how some of that worked?
Sure, I've seen some of the training manuals. By the time May joined the force, there was training, and there was the women's police was separate, just as the Women's Army Corps was there for the Army. And there's a lot of similarities between the two, that the women's organization for the NYPD decided on assignments, etc. Women didn't patrol. They were not patrol officers or roundsmen. The rank structure in New York is like London's. That's where it was taken from. So you see inspectors and deputy chief inspectors, like all of those British murder mysteries we watch. But by the time she joined, she was in the 19th precinct in Upper Manhattan. They didn't have uniforms yet, but oddly enough, they did as volunteers in World War I. I have not figured that one out. So she was primed to be doing detective work, to go undercover. Now, in World War I, the women did not make arrests. They were usually paired with a group of 5 male detectives. For some reason, they were all named William. And everybody in New York, I think, has a nickname. So these were the Willie Boys. And so the women would point out the bad guys, and the Willie Boys would arrest them. But by the time she comes into the 19th precinct, the focus has moved on a little bit. It's prohibition. She was part of the Masher Squad, which was meant to protect women in the subway. So they would arrest men who bothered women. So she had to go to court for that. And several of the other women who she worked with on the Masher Squad, they had a contest to see who could arrest the most. But later on, her husband passed away, and she wanted to move out of the city. So she moved to Queens, which at that time was actually fairly rural. And then she really came into her own with real police work. She went undercover to help thwart a serial killer. Never was caught in New York. He was never caught. But she was part of that initial group that went looking for him. She also served as the head of witness protection for the trial of Lucky Luciano, and she had to manage 40 witnesses for that trial, take them there in the morning, bring them out at night. And there were mobsters chasing her at some point during this. She also went undercover again with the Nazi movement in the 1930s. So there wasn't anything she hadn't tried or done or been involved in, all the way up till 1945 when she decided, I think I need to retire, because her hobby was travel. And she hadn't been able to travel during World War II, and she was missing it. So, midnight on January 1st, 1946, she was free. She took her new car and drove off to Florida. She thought she would stay a long time, but she got bored with it pretty quickly and came back to New York, where she later began to advocate for better pay and benefits for policemen and firefighters.
Did she work to help promote women in the police force?
Not actively, per se. She was there to do her job, and she did her job. The police force in New York will be somewhat political, and May avoided being involved in any politics. She did her job.
Right.
Now, when she advocated for better pay and benefits, she was well retired, and she felt that she could do that then, I think, more safely than making a fuss while she was still in the uniform. So she did do that.
Did she do that as a union rep or just on her own?
She was on her own when she retired, but she did belong to the Police Women's Endowment Association, which was a union while she was in. Now it is an organization within the NYPD, and there are numbers of service organizations that new officers can join. There's a Detectives Association, the Police Women's Association, the Pipes and Drums, and numbers of others. But I have a coin from today's Police Women's Endowment Association, which is in the shape of the shield that she wore at the time. So that's a very special thing to me.
Yeah. Her family, as I understand it, several of them continued on to the law force.
She and her husband John had 2 girls, and Grace, the younger girl, was married and had 2 boys, Bobby and Johnny. Now, Bob never joined the NYPD. He joined the Army, but he stayed in New York, and he was certainly really behind the scenes working with the NYPD and the 108th Precinct in Queens for this effort to rename a street for her. But that was the brainchild of a police commissioner who I met last year when I spoke at the NYPD. Now, Johnny did join the police department, not in New York, but in Greenwood Lake in upstate New York. And he is now retired and lives in Florida. So, Sal, everybody must go to Florida when they retire, I think.
Yeah, we were talking that my mother lived in Florida and retired and was there for a long time. Let me ask you a question. You mentioned that she worked, protecting the women in the subways and, dealing with the Nazis at the time and even the mobsters. Um, and again, I know this goes back to World War One and the 20s and the 30s. Did she? Were you able to find references to any type of undercover work related to drugs? And the reason I ask is we think of drugs and drug enforcement as a fairly recent phenomenon. But I do know that in the 20s and the 30s, they had drug issues just like we have now. It's not like we created them now. So anyway, were you able to find anything related to that?
Oh, sure, there were big issues with drugs, and that was associated with mobsters again, because that was part of their trafficking. Now, one of the witnesses in the Luciano trial, and again, everybody has a nickname, and you'll get it from her nickname, it was Cokie Flo.
Mm.
So, yes. But I did not tell you earlier that in their training, even in 1923, they all learned jujitsu so that they were able to defend themselves if they were not carrying a weapon at the time. Now, when uniforms came for women in the force in 1935, they also got a purse with that in which you could put your revolver. Now, Mayor LaGuardia was there for that ceremony, and he told these policewomen, now, ladies, you need to use 2 things very judiciously in that purse, your lipstick and your gun.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
so they got a big kick out of that.
Yeah.
And it was a revolver. It wasn't like a 1911, just out of curiosity.
It was a 38 revolver for a
Okay.
number of years.
Okay.
I think they carry Glocks now.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I have several policewoman friends, and when we go out, sometimes they're still carrying that, and other times I know there's something in their purse. So I
Yeah.
never, I feel great going out with them. I know I'm protected. So
Well, it's you get used to it. You get used to the feel of it, and it feels odd when you don't have it.
yeah, that's what they said too. She who started the movement to get the street named after her?
Well, I think I mentioned that I met this police commissioner when I
Hmm.
spoke at the NYPD. It was actually in March of this last year, and he said he'd read the book. He questioned me about it in great detail, and he said, "I'm going to see if we can't name the street for her." Now, there's a lot of streets in New York, so you might think this would be easy, but certainly it has to pass through the city and it has to gain approval. So there have to be elected officials who sponsor this, as well as the police department requesting it. And so when I learned that it had been approved and the street would be named for her in front of the precinct where she worked, and as far as I know, this is unprecedented. So I was quite excited to be able to go and see this.
Yes.
And how
So
long did it take from start to finish?
And again, this is apparently unusual. It took them a little more than 6 months. Sometimes it takes years.
Okay.
yeah, I was going to say. Yeah. So the street is named after her. Um, and was her family there? Who was there?
Well, I think every police officer in the entire area was there. It was on a Saturday morning about 3 weeks ago. Grandson Bobby was there, along with his two children. Both served in the NYPD.
Oh,
Tommy is now retired, and Debbie is a court officer.
wow.
So there is the legacy, the family legacy of service in
Mm-hmm.
uniform. So they're ready. And one of the people who you introduced me to just walked by and waved at me. So that's what that was. So there's also Bobby. Bobby was there, but Johnny couldn't travel because he'd been ill. So Johnny's wife, Donna, was there, and she came with me because she's the one who introduced me to the story. And their children and their grandchildren were there. So it was a major family affair. There were representatives from downtown. There were The captain was there from the 108th precinct where she worked for 22 years. I need to send you a picture of all of the policewomen who were there, including the dog handlers, the mounted police, the undercover agents. Everybody came
Wow.
because this was theirs and it was for them.
Yes.
Wow.
And I remember a quote seeing that who was doing the ceremony was that the commissioner said that it was so good to see something, a street named after someone, and not having had someone been shot and died. I mean, that
That was the
really,
head of detectives who said that, the detectives union. He'd been to so many of these naming ceremonies when they're a sad occasion.
yeah,
And he said, in this case, is just happy for the entire community to be able to take part in this.
yes. And I'd like to switch now because you got very much involved. And again, through you, I learned this about the 6888 Central Postal Directory Battalion. Would you tell us more about that? Because that story is absolutely fascinating.
I wanted to write about Charity Adams in my first book. I wanted a chapter on her because what she did was unique. She commanded the only all female, all African American, although there were other women of color in this unit in World War II, and the only one that went overseas. So I found Edna Cummings, retired Colonel Edna Cummings, who I had met before when we were both still on active duty. And she was working to gain some recognition for this unit. So I did have Charity Adams' autobiography. I'd read that. And I also talked to Edna as I was writing this chapter about Charity Adams and what she did.
Hey,
Now, this is
Mary,
just
let
a,
me ask you a quick question because I like to read about World War II a lot, and one of the things that's always amazing to me is how everything was so big, so grand in scale, right? The number of soldiers, the number of bombers, the number of everything. It's compared to what happens today, it just seems so massive. I know they ran into millions of packages. I know it was a whole battalion um, that went overseas. So could you give people again an idea of the scope of what we're talking about in terms of people, in terms of operations? Because everything is, and I think about how you manage and you coordinate that without computers. You know, telephones were still sort of rudimentary. Every means of communication was rudimentary, and yet you had these huge operations.
I think the buildup of the military industrial complex for World War II is one of the greatest feats in history, as far as creating the planes and all of the other equipment that was needed. And certainly, when I talk about this book, what I see are so many people who that my parents served, my grandparents served. Can you tell me where my grandfather was? Or I think my grandmother was with this unit. How can I find out more? So there is still a hunger to learn about what did my family do and how were they part of this massive moment in history. Now, excuse me. So Charity Adams, when she joined, she was in the first class of the Women's Army Corps. So she was the first African American woman to be commissioned as an officer. And when you read about World War II, the more I read, the more I understand the connections. So, okay, so she went through the school. Well, they didn't know what they were doing with the school. So, can you imagine going to a school where they're writing the lesson plans while you're in it? And each day is, well, no, today we're not going to do that. Now we're going to do this. So it was an experiment going through that class and to be in the first one. She had 855 women in that battalion. When you read about World War II units who trained to go overseas, many of them rehearsed, practiced, got ready for up to 2 years before they actually left. She met the people who she would command when they got off the boat in Scotland. And then they went to an abandoned school in Birmingham, England, and that was going to be their headquarters. And Charity Adams, knowing about her, she had a triple major in college: physics, science, and Latin. She knew how to run an operation, and she divided them up into 3 shifts. They worked 24 hours a day. There were 17 million pieces of mail in warehouses because of the pace of operations. It hadn't been able to go forward. So each shift cleared 56,000 pieces of mail. Now, at the Congressional Gold Medal ceremony, Charity's son Stanley was there, and he said, and he's the statistician. So he said, that means they moved a piece of mail every 1.7 seconds.
I did the same math.
Yeah.
So that was it's quite remarkable. It really
Oh,
is.
and by the way, I'm assuming that some of these might have been letters, but a lot of these may have been actual packages, so that
Well,
obviously bigger and
holiday
harder to handle.
packages with rotting food inside. There were rats in the warehouses. Yeah, there was a lot of that. They also had, I think, something like 17,000 letters addressed to Junior, just Junior,
Oh my.
because America was still very rural in so many ways, and so they had to backtrace where it came from to be able to understand who it was going to. So if you've seen the movie, yes, it's fiction. It's fictionalized. There are composite characters. Some things are dramatized, but the scenes showing the mail and how they had to figure out where to get it to, those are pretty amazing. So again, they were given 6 months to do this. Other units had tried and they had failed. They did it in 3 months.
Wow.
So in the Army, what happens when you do well? You get more to do. So then they
Right.
got all the diplomatic mail to sort and ended up in Rouen, France, to complete that mission.
And by the way, one real quick comment, because this is kind of what drove it home to me. I know, and again, it's so hard for us to nowadays put that into context, right? uh, because they didn't have computers, they had to create these little index cards and say, okay, fine, you create the index cards, you don't have computers, whatever. But it was millions of index cards that got created. So to me, just even the process of cataloging and storing your index cards so you know where to even go look when you need to find one particular index card. Because again, you don't have multiple tags, you don't have filters, you don't have search queries. I mean, just the index cards itself to me is like a big project.
Mhm. Yeah. It is like the old card catalog in the library. You would go through it like that to find a book.
I still like it. I like that feel of paper. uh, the what they were moved over to France, as I remember correctly. Weren't they part of the Victory Parade in France or Paris?
They did a
Place?
victory parade in Rouen, then marched right past the place where Joan of Arc was burned at the stake.
Oh.
And after VE Day, they were moved to Paris to await transportation home. Now, as I talk about them now and about some of the other people in that book, I also talk about where they were in September, October 1945. Because immediately in September, right after VJ Day, the U.S. opened up the project called Magic Carpet to return 8 million service members from 55 theaters of operation and 4 continents. And everybody wanted to go home right now.
Yeah.
So this is the Army, right? So we're going to have a point system. So here's your points. You get points for how long you were there, what awards you received, what operations you took part in. So those with the highest number of points got to leave first. There was a lot of grumbling about that.
Yeah.
But by Christmas of 1945, basically most had returned from Europe. And by the next year, the rest had returned from the Pacific. And this took every ship in the inventory, hospital ships, aircraft carriers, destroyers, the ships that had been seconded from the public to get them all back. And if you've seen pictures of hundreds and hundreds of soldiers leaning over the edges of these battleships pulling into New York Harbor, that's what it was like.
Yeah.
So some of Charity's soldiers began to leave in September, and she got home by December.
Wow. I had family relatives that had survived D-Day and other a business partner who had been in the Pacific, and every once in a while you would hear them talk about the stories and what it was like coming home.
Yeah.
That was amazing. Yeah. One thing I wanted to check was, okay, after they came home, what happened to them?
After Charity's group came home, as with many, we think that people came back as units, and they didn't. Again, they came back as individuals. So if there were ceremonies that disestablished a unit or put it into reserve status, they were small. Because again, people wanted to go home because they had been gone, some of them for more than 2 to 3 years.
Right.
There were no big parades until 1946. Unit parade, and that was the 82nd Airborne in New York City, and they practiced for months before that. I mean, there were parades in New York. There was a parade for Eisenhower, and May Foley was there to see that one.
Oh.
But there were no big unit parades, so people went back to work or began to look for jobs or to go back to college. Charity Adams married a nice man she had met overseas, Stanley Early. He was an interpreter who spoke fluent French and German, and he wanted to go to medical school. So he went to medical school in Switzerland, and she was there as well, working on her master's degree in counseling. And she later became the Dean of Women at 2 universities and served on a number of boards, including the Red Cross. And one of the things Stanley says about his mother is, what they didn't know was she reads everything. She would come into a board meeting, and they would say, everybody okay with the proposal here? Let's vote. And she would say, I have a question. on page 240, part 3CA, paragraph F. What does that mean when you say, because she didn't leave out any details?
Mhm.
Huh.
She had to be
Well,
a
actually, you
Virgo.
know what? That segues into a little bit of question I wanted to ask you for this book and for the Foley book and for everything. Um, Again, how hard is it to do the research? Could you give people sort of an indication of the work that goes behind the book to do the research? Because again, we're talking documents and situations from World War II, from before World War II. Again, for people that are younger than us, they think everything's on the computer. Everything's not on the computer. You got to drive somewhere, maybe go into some file, a microfiche. I don't even know. But could you give us kind of a flavor for the work and the legwork that goes behind putting together all these books?
Well, for World War II, there is a lot that you can find. So there are military records. Some of them were destroyed in a fire at the Records Center in the mid 50s. But even some of those that people were told, no, your records were part of that fire, some of them are still being put back together, and it would pay to take another look or make another request to see them. So if you have your father's, your grandfather's service number, you can find where he served. Maybe there was somebody in that unit who wrote a history, a family history. And I have found several of those where somebody else's book mentions the people I'm writing about and where they were at certain times.
Mhm.
There's major histories, there's newspapers. There was a lot of newspaper coverage of our boys coming home and articles about the women as well at the time. And I have seen some of these in Ancestry or others of these organizations and websites where you can do family history lookups. You can also sign up to get into newspapers.com and see what was written in, because people were really, really welcomed back home. In all of these small towns, there was a lot of write-ups, so you'll find quite a bit about them. The VFW and the American Legion grew exponentially with members. Um, one of the nurses I wrote about was a member of the Battle of the Bulge Association for many, many years. It's when you go back a little further towards World War I, it's more difficult. Now, in New York is a problem for me because there were hundreds of John Foleys, hundreds of Mary Foleys, and it's either too much or too little. In a small town, you might not find anything. So with New York, too, there are in all of these newspapers, because there were newspapers that came out first thing in the morning, noon, mid-afternoon, evening. And truth was an option for most of them. And in some, it was, well, an add-on if you wanted it. So I found in one newspaper an article about how she had disarmed a woman who attacked her, a drug dealer, in jail. Another newspaper took the pictures and made a meme out of them where Miss Foley is strangling the bad woman in the jail cell.
Oh my.
So you have to be very careful with using newspapers from that era because, again, it was so political in New York. There were so many mayors, so many police commissioners, so many different captains within the service that it was very difficult at times to sort them out, according to their years and where they were. But finding the firsthand accounts, a lot of people wrote autobiographies or stories for their families. That was easy.
Well, um, we've been talking for about 35 minutes, and I know you have a speech to give. Just give us a brief outline of your next coming book.
Sure. Well, the next book is, of course, the same era. Now that I know so much about this era, I keep returning to it. So this is about sports, how sports grew and changed in this country and elsewhere from the early 1900s
Hmm.
through World War II, up through Title IX.
Yes.
The issues with being an amateur versus a professional and how that prevented so many incredibly talented people, men and women, from appearing in more than one Olympics. or having more than one opportunity to compete because they couldn't make a living otherwise.
Mm.
Now, Babe Deirdrickson Zaharis, the golfer, excuse me, appeared in the 1923 Olympics. If she could have entered every event she wanted in track and field, she would have medaled in all of them.
Wow.
It wasn't legal. And then they said the AAU said, she wasn't really an amateur because she posed with a new car, and they pulled her amateur status. So that's when she turned to golf. But she has been called the greatest athlete of the 20th century. And when you read about her, you can see why.
Wow. Sal, would you like, is there anything you would like to ask before we do a wrap up?
Just real quick, reminder again, we're going to put links to everything in the description. So if anybody's interested in a particular book, the calendar, associations, there'll be links there. Just maybe one last question. How much do you interpolate, for lack of a better term, knowing sort of the era? Like you say, hey, I discovered a newspaper article and it didn't say that they did this, but I know it was very common in that town in that time period to do this. So I'm going to kind of build it into the story because it's a very reasonable assumption. How much of that do you do or don't do?
One of the things I learned in New York was that in the 20s and 30s, every year landlords would renegotiate leases starting in February. And then they would be renewed, say in June or so, or the people would vacate if the cost went up. So that's why you had new phone books every fall. This was something I didn't know, but it was so pervasive and so common. And when I looked at all the places May lived, it was here, there, here, 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 close by within a radius within Queens for quite a while, but in Brooklyn. So it was easy to assume that, yes, she was probably part of this. And I did find one or two phone books that proved it. So that was one of the things I had used. But as far as the flavor of the time, I was in New York talking about the first book, working on the second one, when I spent an extra day there and hired a tour guide to take me and show me around. This is a company that does tours for special groups or, say, movie producers wanting to look at mobster times or something. And so I said, I want 1933 through 1945. Show me where she lived. Show me where she would walk. So I said, so she took the subway in from Queens. And he said, no, that is the 7 train. So then I learned I had better use the correct expressions. So he showed me where the speakeasies were when she worked in Prohibition, where the speakeasy is hidden inside Grand Central Station, where she would have come in on the 7 train and then walked down to Broadway. She would have walked through the Rockefeller Center when it was being built, first building in New York to have air conditioning. So it was fascinating to think of her walking through there as it's being built, the land deals that went into making this huge building. And so I saw a lot of places where she would have gone. And I said, so what about Madison Square Garden? Because it's over. He said, no. In 1940, it wasn't there. It was over here. So it kept me on track and honest about where locations were, the correct expressions to make the feel of the time right. And that was really important.
That was smart of you. I'll have to think of that for my next book. Well, I know you have a speech to give. So again, thank you for your time. Thank you for your service. And look forward to interviewing you on your next book.
If I can add one more thing, my agent told me to say this. So about 2 weeks ago, I made the USA Today Bestselling Author list. So I can now say I am a best-selling author. So
yes,
Congratulations.
thank
congratulations.
you. And she's now happy I said that.
Yes. You can even say that twice. How about that?
No, I can't. I trip up over it.
Sal, would you like to do a wrap up, please?
Yeah, just want to say thank you for your time, being so gracious with your time and your knowledge, and giving us a flavor for what happens behind the book. Um, and we appreciate your effort. Thank you, and of course the effort for keeping that women's history alive, which, like you said, may have been on the fringe, may have not gotten the focus and the coverage that it should have, either at the time or even still now. So you're bringing it to the forefront, and we appreciate that.
Well, at the time, nobody wanted to get credit. They were, no, I don't need a medal. I don't need, need to say anything about me. I just did my part.
Hmm.
And it was the modesty of the greatest generation is what we see. And
Yeah,
that's true throughout. So I think this is for the families. That's who it's for.
yeah, yeah. Well, thank you very much. And to our next conversation, uh, I'll have a wonderful time investigating your history.
Thank you so much.